The fifth largest city in the United States is running out of water. Phoenix, Arizona. 4.5 million people in a desert that gets 8 inches of rain a year. In 2025, the federal government cut Arizona's share of the Colorado River by nearly a third. As I record this, 87% of the state is in drought, and the river that feeds the city sits at barely a third of its capacity. None of this is new, because 700 years ago, on the exact same patch of desert, under the same sun, drinking from the same rivers, another civilization faced this exact problem. They built the largest irrigation system in the ancient Americas. Hundreds of miles of canals, dug by hand without the wheel, without metal, without a single animal to pull a load. They turned raw desert into farmland that fed tens of thousands of people for 1,000 years. And then, around 1450, they vanished so completely that we don't even know what they called themselves. Phoenix is named after a bird that rises from the ashes of something that died. The people who named it knew exactly what they were building on top of. They just didn't think it applied to them. This is the story of the Hohokam, and it is not a story about the past. Start with the problem they solved, because it was almost impossible. The Sonoran Desert is one of the harshest places in North America. Summers past 115 degrees. Rain that is scarce, then violent, long droughts, broken by flash floods. Nothing about it says, build a civilization here. And yet, around the year 300, a people we now call the Hohokam looked at that desert and saw what no one else had. 2 rivers running through it. The Salt and the Gila. The water was there. It was just in the wrong place. So they moved it. What they built is one of the great engineering feats of the ancient world. And almost no one outside Arizona has heard of it. A network of canals stretching more than 500 miles across the Salt River Valley. The largest ran 4 miles, some as wide as a road, some cut 15 feet deep. A main canal pulled water off the river, then split, again and again, like a river system run in reverse. And they did it with no metal tools, no wheel, no horses, no oxen. They cut those canals with wooden sticks and carried the earth out one woven basket at a time. Millions of baskets over generations, by hand. But moving the water was the easy part. Keeping it moving was the genius. A canal in a desert is a machine that constantly tries to destroy itself. It silts up, the banks erode. The grade has to be exactly right, or it fails. The Hohokam controlled that flow across hundreds of miles and maintained the system for over 1,000 years. At its peak, it fed between 30 and 80,000 people. Their trade reached the Pacific coast and deep into Mexico. They built ball courts and mounds aligned to the solstices. This was not a handful of farmers in the sand. This was a civilization, sophisticated, organized, and utterly dependent on one thing. The water had to keep moving. And this is where the Hohokam story becomes bigger than the Hohokam. The canal system that made them powerful was also the thing that made them fragile. It's a pattern this channel has traced across 4 civilizations now, on 4 continents. A society builds a system so effective that everything comes to depend on it. The system becomes the foundation, and a foundation cannot fail because there is nothing underneath it. For the Hohokam, the canals weren't just infrastructure. They were the whole basis of the society. Their food, their cities, their population, their trade. All of it sat on one assumption, that water would keep flowing through those channels the way it always had, that held for 1,000 years. Then the rivers changed their mind. The Salt River is not stable. Tree rings and sediment tell a violent story. The salt swung between catastrophic floods and grinding droughts. And the more advanced the canal system became, the more people it fed, the less room it had to absorb a shock. Think about what a big flood does to a canal network. It tears out the headgates, where the canals meet the river. It recarves the riverbed, sometimes dropping it so low that the old canal mouths are left pointing at water they can no longer reach. After a flood like that, you don't clean up. You have to re-engineer the connection between the river and your entire civilization. And drought does the opposite. Less water in the river, less in the canals, less food for a population grown to the exact limit of what the system could feed. The Hohokam had optimized so completely for a stable river that they had nothing left for an unstable one. Every acre was farmed. Every drop the system could carry was carried. No reserve, no backup, no simpler life to fall back on, because that simpler life had been abandoned 1,000 years earlier when they bet everything on the canals. They had built the most advanced water system in the ancient Americas, and in doing so, they had made themselves more vulnerable to water than the people who never built it at all. The end, when it came, did not look like an ending. Around the middle of the 1300s, the signs begin. A massive flood appears to have wrecked the canal systems. And starting around 1350, accelerating through 1400, the villages of the Salt River Valley began to empty. Not all at once, not in fire. There is no layer of ash, no mass grave, no sign of a final battle. What the archaeology shows instead is quieter and stranger. A rapid dispersal, household by household. People simply left. They walked away from the canals their ancestors had spent 1,000 years digging and scattered. By 1450, the great villages were silent. The canals filled with silt and sand. A civilization of tens of thousands had come apart into the landscape, leaving behind only the ditches and no name. Because here is the strangest fact in this story. We do not know what the Hohokam called themselves. Hohokam isn't their name. It's a word from the Awadam, the people who came after, and it means roughly. Those who are gone. We describe an entire civilization with a word that means the ones who aren't here anymore. For centuries, the explanation was simple. Drought killed them. But the closer archaeologists look, the less simple it gets. The drought was real. Yet the Hohokam had survived droughts before, and floods before. 1,000 years of practice. What broke, in the end, wasn't the weather. It was the fit between a rigid system and a world that refused to stay stable. The canals could handle a normal river. They could not handle a century of extremes landing on a society that had left itself no margin. The thing that let them conquer the desert was the thing that couldn't bend when the desert changed the rules. Their descendants didn't vanish. The Archimel Owadam and Tohono Owadam of southern Arizona carry that ancestry. The people of the canals didn't die. They just stopped being the people of the canals. If you're the kind of person who finds this more interesting than the version they taught you in school, that's the whole channel. Every week, one civilization, one autopsy. Subscribe and you won't miss the next one. If that sounds like a warning, safely locked in the deep past, look at where those canals are today. In the late 1860s, a former Confederate soldier and prospector named Jack Swilling was riding through the Salt River Valley when he noticed something in the ground. Long, straight depressions running across the desert. Ancient ditches, silted, obviously man-made, obviously old. He understood at once. Someone had moved water here, on a massive scale. So he did the logical thing. He formed a canal company, dug out the old Hohokam channels, and used them. The city that grew up around those canals needed a name. One of the founders, a man who knew his classics, proposed Phoenix, the bird consumed by fire that rises, reborn from the ashes of what came before. It was deliberate. They knew they were building a new civilization on the bones of a dead one, and picked a name that celebrated exactly that. They just didn't finish the thought. Because modern Phoenix doesn't only sit near the Hohokam canals. In places, it sits directly on top of them. Some major modern canals follow the same routes the Hohokam surveyed by hand 1,000 years ago. 20th century engineers found the ancient people had already mapped the best path for water and simply widened it. You can still see original Hohokam canals near the airport. The rest are buried under the 5th largest city in America. Phoenix didn't just build on their ruins. It inherited their exact problem. Same desert, same rivers, same brutal equation, an enormous population in a place that cannot support it, held up entirely by the human ability to move water. The Hohokam solved that equation for 1,000 years. Then the rivers changed, and the solution couldn't change with them. Phoenix has been solving the same equation for about 150 years, where the two stories stop running in parallel and start running into each other. Modern Phoenix doesn't rely on the salt alone. Its largest source of water is the Colorado, pumped hundreds of miles uphill across the desert through the Central Arizona Project Canal. It is the Hohokam system, scaled up to the size of a state. The same idea. The water is in the wrong place, so we move it, and the Colorado is failing. More than 20 years of megadrought have dropped it to about a third of its capacity. In 2025, the federal government imposed a Tier 1 shortage, cutting Arizona's Colorado River supply by more than 5,000 acre-feet, roughly 30% of what flows through that great central canal. 87% of the state is in drought, and the 7 states that share the river still cannot agree on how to divide what's left. I want to be fair, because the differences matter. Phoenix is not Hohokam. It has spent decades preparing for exactly this, storing water underground, drilling wells, building a $300 million drought pipeline. It has reserves the Hohokam could never have imagined. Nobody's taps run dry tomorrow. But listen to the shape of the problem, and tell me it doesn't sound familiar. A large population, in a desert the land cannot support, held up entirely by an engineered system for moving water from far away. Optimized, over generations, for a river assumed to keep flowing the way it always had, and a climate now quietly refusing to cooperate. The Hohokam were not primitive. They were us, running the same experiment, with the same confidence, 700 years early. They also believed their ingenuity had permanently solved the problem of living where they couldn't. The canals are still there, under the airport, under the freeways, under 4.5 million people who are, right now, in a Tier 1 shortage. We like to believe collapse happens to other people, simpler people, people without our technology, our reserves, our understanding. That's the comfort history usually gives us. The fall always belongs to someone less capable than we are. The Hohokam take that comfort away. They were the finest water engineers of their world. They didn't fall because they were primitive. They fell because they were successful. Successful enough to build a civilization that could only exist as long as one system kept working exactly as designed. Phoenix chose its name, knowing it rose from the ashes of the people who came before. The question the desert is asking now, the same question it asked in 1450, is whether the bird that rose from those ashes remembers that the fire is not a story about the past. It's a story about the river, and the river is still deciding. This is the 4th collapse we've put on the table. Same pattern, different century. The Bronze Age, the Maya, Cahokia, and now the desert. If you want the rest of the series, they're one click away. And subscribing is how you get the next one. I'll see you next time.